My name is Daniel Reeves, and the worst mistake of my life was moving to Miller's Hollow, a place so small it doesn't show up on most maps. I thought I was escaping my past, but what I found in that quiet little town was something much older, something that never sleeps, and now it knows my name. I moved to Miller's Hollow in late September, right before the trees turned into a blanket of orange and red. It was the kind of small town where the roads narrowed into cracked asphalt, and mailboxes were held up by leaning wooden posts. Everything about it felt slow, like time had forgotten it. And that's exactly what I wanted, a place where I could disappear for a while, clear my head, and not have to answer questions I didn't want to talk about anymore. After quitting my job and ending a long, messy relationship, I needed distance from everything. I found the house online, listed for cheap, with just a single grainy photo of the porch and a few lines about how it had belonged to a woman named Helen Miller. It sat on the far edge of town, with woods backing up against the yard. There were no neighbors in sight, just a long gravel driveway and the constant sound of birds. When I arrived, the place felt tired. The paint was faded and the porch creaked under my weight. But it was quiet, and that's what mattered most. I spent the first day unpacking, trying to ignore the feeling that the air inside the house was just a little too still. It had that smell old houses get when they've been empty for a while: dry wood, dust, and something else, faint, earthy. That night I noticed how dark it got. I don't mean just nighttime dark, I mean pitch black. No streetlights, no car headlights in the distance, no glow from nearby houses. Just a complete curtain of darkness that swallowed everything beyond the porch light. I stood outside for a while, listening to the silence, and felt a strange sensation, like I was being watched. It didn't feel threatening at first, just unfamiliar, heavy. The next morning, I went into town for groceries. It was one main road, lined with a gas station, a diner, and a general store. Inside the store, the cashier gave me a polite smile until I mentioned the address I'd moved into. Her expression changed. She didn't say much after that, just handed me my receipt and turned away. I noticed the same thing later at the diner when I stopped for lunch. A few people asked where I was from. When I told them I'd just moved into the old Miller place, the conversation would stop. One man muttered something under his breath before walking out. No one offered much more than vague nods and silence. I brushed it off. Small towns always had their own stories and gossip. Maybe Helen Miller wasn't popular. Maybe something bad had happened there, and people just didn't want to relive it. That night I couldn't sleep. The house made unfamiliar noises, pops in the walls, creaks on the floorboards. I kept thinking I heard footsteps on the porch, soft and measured. Every time I got up to check, there was nothing, just empty silence and the buzzing of the porch light. I told myself it was probably animals, a raccoon maybe, or some stray cats. It was the woods, after all. But the next morning I found something I couldn't explain. On the back steps, just outside the kitchen door, were muddy footprints. Small, barefoot. They looked like they belonged to a child. Each step was clearly outlined in the drying dirt, leading up to the door but not away from it. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, trying to come up with some rational reason for why they were there. A neighborhood kid playing a prank, a lost child, but that didn't make sense. No one had mentioned kids in the area, and I would have heard if someone had come that close to the house. I wiped them away with a rag and tried not to think too hard about it. But from that moment on, something about the house started to feel different, like I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. The fog rolled in thick the next morning, heavier than I'd ever seen. It swallowed the backyard, the trees beyond it, even the edge of the porch. It looked like the world had ended 10 feet from my door. The silence felt different too, heavier, more aware. I stepped outside with a mug of coffee, telling myself it was just another foggy morning in the woods, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from inside that dense wall of white. And then I saw her. At first it was just a shape, a faint outline between the trees. I squinted, thinking it was a deer or maybe just my eyes playing tricks in the mist. But as I stared, the figure became clearer. It was a child, a little girl standing perfectly still at the edge of the woods. She wore a faded yellow dress that looked oddly clean for someone standing barefoot in the dirt. Her arms hung at her sides. Her face was too far to see clearly, but I could feel her eyes locked on me. I blinked, and she was gone. No movement, no footsteps, just vanished into the fog like she was never there. I didn't tell anyone about it. Who was I going to tell anyway? The people in town already treated me like an outsider, and the last thing I needed was to sound crazy. I spent most of the day trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light, some optical illusion caused by the fog, but deep down I knew better. Later that afternoon, I walked into town again. At the store, I casually asked if any families lived nearby, specifically if anyone had kids. The woman behind the counter looked at me strangely. "There haven't been kids near the Miller place in years," she said without looking up. Her voice was flat. Final. That night I couldn't shake the image of the girl. I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the old bones of the house settle. Around 2 a.m., I heard something, a soft tapping. It was slow, rhythmic, coming from the window beside my bed. I sat up, heart pounding. The blinds were down, but the sound didn't stop. I reached over and lifted the corner just enough to peek outside. Nothing, just a faint glow from the moon behind the fog and the outline of trees in the distance. No figure, no movement, but the tapping continued, steady and delicate. I pulled the covers over my head and stayed like that until the sun came up. When I finally got up and went outside, I found more footprints. Not on the porch this time, but under my bedroom window. The same size, same bare feet. They led from the tree line straight to the wall, then back again, disappearing into the woods. I walked the perimeter of the house. There were no other tracks, no tire marks, no signs of animals, just those prints alone. I couldn't explain it, and the more I tried, the more absurd everything felt. A ghost, a hallucination. But none of those made sense. The footprints were real. I could touch them, feel the dried mud on my fingers. Something or someone was coming to my house at night. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That I saw a little girl in the fog and now there were footprints outside my window. They'd think I was losing my mind. Maybe I was, but that night, as I locked every window and double-checked the doors, I felt something shift in the air again, like the house was waiting, watching. And just before I fell asleep, I could have sworn I heard laughter, quiet, faint, from the woods. The laughter stuck with me. It wasn't loud or playful like a normal child's laugh. It was distant, like it was echoing through something far older than the trees. I tried to forget about it, chalk it up to an overactive mind and too many horror stories rattling around in my head. But the truth was sinking in whether I liked it or not. Something wasn't right about this place. A few days passed in silence. No footprints, no fog, no tapping. But that somehow made it worse. It was like the house had taken a breath and was holding it. Every night I sat up in bed listening, waiting for that sound to come back. Nothing did. But that heavy feeling never left, the sense that I was being observed, studied from some invisible distance. I couldn't sit with the unknown anymore. I had to understand what I was living in. I headed to the town's tiny library, just off the main road, tucked behind an old church. A woman in her 70s ran the place. Her name was Judy, and unlike the rest of the town, she didn't shy away when I said I lived at the Miller house. She didn't smile either, just nodded slowly and pointed me toward a filing cabinet in the back corner, where old newspaper clippings and property records were kept. I spent the next few hours combing through yellowed paper and faded ink. Most of it was nothing, sales records, old zoning maps, but then I found it, a single sheet from 1975. The headline read, "Local Girl Missing Search Underway." The black and white photo was grainy, but I could make out the girl's face, wide eyes, straight hair, faint smile. Her name was Abigail Miller. The article said she was last seen playing in the woods behind the house. She never came back inside. Her mother, Helen Miller, called the police that evening, and for 3 days the entire town searched. Dogs, volunteers, helicopters, no trace, not even a shoe. The article ended on a hopeful note, asking the public to remain vigilant. But I couldn't find anything after that. No follow-ups, no resolution. It was like the story had just ... stopped. I asked Judy about it. She paused for a long time, then said softly, "People around here don't like to talk about Abigail or Helen. Best not to stir it up." When I pressed her, she finally added something that chilled me. Some folks said Helen lost her mind after that, started walking in the woods alone, said she saw things, heard her talking to someone who wasn't there. That night, back at the house, I sat at the kitchen table staring at Abigail's photo. I couldn't stop thinking about the little girl in the yellow dress, the one I saw in the fog, the one who had stood outside my window. It had to be her. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with that. I wasn't even sure what I believed anymore, but something was calling me, pulling me deeper into whatever story had been buried in this house, in this town. Just after midnight, I went outside with a flashlight and walked to the edge of the woods. I didn't know what I was looking for, maybe a piece of clothing, a toy, anything that might explain what I'd seen. The air felt thicker the farther I went in. I called her name, Abigail. My voice sounded swallowed by the trees. Then I heard whispers, faint, quick, not coming from one direction but many, all around me. I turned in a slow circle, the flashlight beam jumping from branch to shadow. I felt something brush my hand. It was cold, soft, like the fingers of a child. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back inside, door locked, heart racing. In the morning I found muddy footprints again. This time they were inside. I didn't leave the house for the rest of the day. I sat at the edge of my bed, staring at the prints on the floor like they were going to rearrange themselves into something logical. But there was no explanation that made sense. They started near the front door, wandered through the living room, and stopped in the hallway leading to my bedroom. Just ... stopped. No return trail, no sign of the door ever opening. I checked every window, locked. I scoured the house from top to bottom for any way, and nothing. No broken screens, no footprints outside. The prints had simply appeared, as if she had walked out of the floorboards. I took pictures, I don't know why. Maybe to prove to myself I wasn't losing it. Maybe to have something to show someone if I ever got brave enough to talk to anyone about it. Later that evening, I went back to the library. Judy wasn't there, but someone else was. A man in his 60s with thick glasses and a name tag that read Doug. I told him I'd been reading up on the Millers, and his demeanor changed almost instantly. He lowered his voice and leaned closer. "You should be careful digging into that," he said. "The town's let that story go for a reason." I told him about the girl I saw, about the footprints. He didn't look surprised, just tired, like he'd heard this before. "You're not the first," he said. "People who stay at that house, they see her too. Helen used to talk about it near the end, said Abigail never left, said she came back to her, but different." I asked him what he meant by different. He hesitated, then said, "She wasn't right. The girl that came back to her wasn't the same one who went missing." That night, I searched the woods again. I don't know what I expected, maybe to find the place where Abigail disappeared, or some piece of her still out there. I followed a narrow path behind the house, a trail nearly swallowed by brush and thyme. After half an hour of walking, I saw it. A stump, cracked and weathered, with what looked like a bundle of cloth resting on top. As I got closer, my breath caught in my throat. It was a yellow dress, faded, small, folded neatly like someone had placed it there recently. The air felt wrong around it, charged, almost electric, like the moment before a storm hits. I stood still, waiting, listening. Behind the stump, there was a tree, large, gnarled, its bark twisted in strange patterns. At eye level, something had been carved into the trunk. I leaned in closer, squinting. It was my name, rough, deep cuts into the wood, letters that hadn't been there a week ago. I stepped back, stumbling slightly, and the woods seemed to shift around me. The trees felt closer, the air heavier. I ran, all the way back to the house, heart pounding, lungs burning. That night, the temperature inside dropped sharply. I lit the fireplace just to keep the chill off. But the cold wasn't the worst part. It was the silence, the oppressive, unnatural quiet that blanketed everything. And then came the tapping, soft, measured, coming from the hall. I got out of bed and opened the door slowly. The hallway stretched out, dimly lit by the light from the fireplace. Nothing was there until I looked down. More footprints, fresh, wet, leading from my bedroom toward the attic stairs. I stared at the footprints, my throat tight, breath shallow. They were unmistakably fresh, still glistening slightly on the wood, small toes splayed just enough to show weight. They started at the foot of my bed and led all the way down the hall, stopping at the narrow attic stairs I hadn't touched since moving in. I hadn't even opened that door. It had been sealed with a warped latch, almost like it hadn't been used in decades. But now it was open. The door stood slightly ajar, the darkness behind it like a mouth waiting to speak. Every instinct I had screamed at me to leave, to grab my keys, run to the car, and never look back. But something stronger rooted me there, a terrible curiosity, a need to understand what had been happening. I had to see what was up there. I had to know if she was real. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way slowly up the narrow stairs. The wood creaked under my feet, each step feeling louder than the last. At the top, the door opened into a low, unfinished space that smelled of rot and old fabric. My flashlight beam shook in my hand as I scanned the attic. It was mostly empty, save for a few dusty boxes and an old wooden rocking chair facing the far wall. I stepped inside and the door creaked shut behind me. The chair rocked once, then stopped. I held the light steady and walked closer. There, resting on the seat, was a stuffed rabbit, one eye missing, the seams along the ears nearly undone. A faded yellow ribbon was tied around its neck. It looked ancient. I leaned down and picked it up. Underneath, carved directly into the seat of the rocking chair, were initials, A.M. Abigail Miller. I stood in silence, holding the toy, the only sound my breathing, and the faint hum of the wind outside. And then something changed. The air shifted. A sound rose from behind me, soft, slow breathing. I turned quickly, but there was nothing. My flashlight flickered, the bulb whining for a second before dying completely, plunging the attic into total darkness. I felt movement. Not footsteps, more like a presence passing through. Cold air brushed against my arm like fingers. I froze, and then I heard a voice, not loud but inside my head or maybe just behind it. A whisper that didn't belong to any living person. "You shouldn't be here." I scrambled down the stairs in pitch black, heart pounding, dropping the flashlight as I went. When I reached the hallway, I slammed the attic door shut and wedged a chair beneath the handle. I didn't sleep. I sat on the living room couch until morning, lights on, staring at that door, waiting for it to move. It never did. By sunrise, I'd made my decision. I packed everything I could fit into my car and left without looking back. I didn't tell the town, didn't leave a note. I just drove. But that's not the end. 3 nights later, in a motel 2 towns over, I woke up to a sound I hadn't heard since I left the house. Tapping. I sat up, my skin crawling. The window beside the bed was fogged over, the glass damp with condensation. I wiped it with my sleeve. And there, just outside, was a small, muddy footprint, pressed against the glass. Too high for a child to reach, too perfect to be imagined. She found me, and I don't think she ever plans to let me go.